So back in test fragment, we've got onCreateView, we've got onViewCreated. I'm going to go ahead and add the onCreate method, and I'm going to put these methods in the order that they should be called. So we have onCreate, and onCreateView, onViewCreated. I could go ahead and do onResume, onStart, then onStop and onPause. I'm not going to because you've already seen that concept many times in the Activity Lifecycle tutorials. I will do the opposing method to onCreateView, which is onDestroyView, because that's another method you don't get in an activity, so onDestroyView. And the last things I'll put in are those two extra methods, onAttach and onDetach. So before onCreate, we have onAttach, and we're given access to a context, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. And then after onDestroyView, we will have onDetach. So we have the code in main activity to add the fragment, but what we don't have is the ability to remove the fragment to see some of these, what I call tear down methods, where the fragment is taken down and things are removed. So to do that, there's another transaction we can do in our support fragment manager. In remove fragment, we'll do support fragment manager again and .commit. And now we have another fragment transaction. And I mentioned a while ago we'd talk a bit more about fragment transactions when we first looked at this code. All a fragment transaction is a thing you can do with a fragment in relation to where its host would be. You can add fragments, you can replace fragments, remove fragments. These are all fragment transactions. And this fragment manager thing that we have access to, that takes a fragment object that you give it, it will attach it to whatever host, whatever context it needs attaching to. Could be a container, could be an activity. And then it takes care of instantiating the fragment in terms of the lifecycle. So things like onCreate, onCreateView. It is the fragment manager's job to do that. And the information, the instruction to do that is your fragment transaction. So scary sounding word fragment transaction, but all it is an instruction to do something with a fragment and the fragment host. Okay? So for remove fragment, we have a method called remove. And you can see there's only one thing that we can give the remove method, and that is actually the fragment object. Now, we can't just go ahead and make a new fragment object like this, because thinking way back to our programming concept on classes and objects, this would be a different object. It would not find this version of test fragment in the fragment manager. It wouldn't be able to find it. So what we're going to need to do is make one version of test fragment as a class property, and then we can add it and remove it at will. So at the very top, I'm going to make another variable, so private value called our test fragment. I'm going to make that equal to a new instance. So we'll be a bit lazy. We'll just go ahead and create it as soon as the main activity is created, and we'll hold on to this test fragment variable there. So now, when we add the fragment, we can just add that variable, test fragment. And indeed, when it comes time for us to remove the fragment, we can remove it with the same variable. And what I will do is I will put a breakpoint within this fragment transaction and the remove transaction. And I'll also put some debug points in all of these lifecycle methods. So attach, onCreate, onCreateView, onViewCreated, onDestroyView, and onDetach. And as we move through these different lifecycle methods, we can talk about why you might use them, some best practice to try and stick to, and then we should have a good overview of the important parts of the fragment lifecycle that you can use in your programming. So let's go ahead now and click the debug icon and run this in debug mode, and hopefully we will navigate through these lifecycle methods and we can talk about them. So we're back in our Activity Lifecycle playground, and none of the debug points have been hit yet because there is no fragment. So even though in main activity here we made a new test fragment object, this object exists, none of the lifecycle methods, including onCreate, were called. Okay? And now if I click show fragment, well, the first thing we hit is the add method in the main activity, so show fragment, add. When we advance past this debug point, things should start to happen in test fragment. So let's advance. So first of all, before anything else, we hit onAttach. And if I look down in my debugger at this context parameter that I have access to, I can see that the context is main activity. I can even expand it and see the binding variable and the test fragment. So when you add a fragment to the support fragment manager, it is attached to whatever context, and mostly that's going to be the parent activity. And in a moment, I'm going to show you one way that you could communicate with the parent activity using this onAttach method. For now, they will continue, so we'll click the advance button, the resume program, then we hit onCreate, then we get onCreateView, and then finally onViewCreated, and then we don't hit anything further. And our fragment is now showing on the screen. And then when I click remove fragment, well, first of all, we hit the remove fragment debug point, and when I advance, we hit onDestroyView, and then onDetach. And then if I go back to the emulator, the fragment has disappeared. So let's just refer back now to these methods. So in the code, I'll close the debug panel. I'll talk about onAttach and onDetach shortly, but first I want to talk about this onCreate method. So fragments have onCreate, just like activities have onCreate. But if you think in an activity in onCreate, well, that's where you would set the content view. We don't do this in fragments. We do it in onCreateView. And in fact, onCreateView should only have the setup for the view. And in the case of view binding, that should just simply be setting up the binding variable and then returning the binding.root, our root view. You shouldn't do much more than that really in onCreateView. When you want to start interacting with your views, like updating text, adding click listeners, this should be done in onViewCreated. So please get into this habit in your projects and in your own code. Just set up your binding and inflate your view and return it in onCreateView and do all of the heavy lifting in onViewCreated. Now you'll notice in onViewCreated, in the parameters, as well as the view that we've just created, this view parameter, we also have access to the saved instance state, very much like in our activity saved instance state. And we also have it in the onCreate method. So we have saved instance state here, and we also have it in onViewCreated. Incidentally, we also have access to it in onCreateView. So all three of these methods have access to it. And as onCreate happens before onCreateView, and we don't have any sort of view to access in onCreate, the onCreate method in fragments isn't as useful as it is in activities. And so for this reason, it's very rare that I ever find myself needing to use the onCreate method in fragments. So I'm going to go ahead now and remove the onCreate method. There's not really many use cases where you would need it. There may be one or two, and it would be for specific circumstances where you're doing things before you create your view. But this isn't very common. So in fragment, really, onCreateView is like our onCreate method in activities. This is the key one where we create the view for the fragment. And then onViewCreated is where you can then start getting to work. You've still got access to your saved instance state. So these two methods working together are the methods that you use in fragments to get your screen set up, ready for the user to start interacting with. Okay? OnDestroyView might be where you might clean some things up. You might reset some variables that relate to your view. If you've been holding on to variables in the fragment, you might make them null. But again, it's not too often you need to do too much with the OnDestroyView method. So this is another one that I rarely find myself needing to use. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this one. And that just leaves our onAttach and onDetach methods. And as we have access to this context parameter in our onAttach method, there's actually a fairly common use case for using these two methods. And it's to do with the way that a fragment can communicate with its host activity. So let's take a look in the next tutorial at how this works. as you start to build more and more advanced Android applications, you may find yourself needing to communicate with the activity somehow. You might have a parent activity with a bottom navigation, and then that bottom navigation switches between lots of fragments, but you might have like a global logout button that exists in one of your fragments, and you might need to communicate that upwards to the activity, so the activity can log the user out of the whole app. That's one example. Well, an old-fashioned but still perfectly usable method of communicating with an activity is using the onAttach and onDetach method. And let me show you how it works. Now, you saw when we debugged, you would have access to the whole main activity object, but that can be a little bit dangerous. You don't be calling methods like onPause or onSaved instance state directly on main activity, but you would be able to do that if you were playing with a whole main activity class. So with this method, what people tend to do is they define an interface in the fragment. And this interface, a bit like a button click listener with onClick, it just defines the behavior that you would want to access in your activity. So I'm going to make this interface, and I'm going to call it my test fragment listener. Remember, an interface is a contract, so we can make our main activity be a test fragment listener. It says, I promise to implement whatever methods within the test fragment listener interface, and then it's a contract. It can fulfill those methods. And let's just do an example to show how the fragment can control things and interact with things in the activity. Let's have a function that will clear the activity screen. No parameters, just a simple request to clear whatever is in the activity. Okay? And then we can make a variable in the test fragment class to refer to this. We'll make it a nullable variable because at first we won't have a listener. So private variable, this can be our fragment listener. And we'll make this equal to a test fragment listener, that interface we made, and we'll make it nullable, and we'll initialize it to null. So what we're saying is, we've defined a contract here, and anyone who's a test fragment listener will have a method called clear activity screen. We can then head back to main activity, and next to where it says app compatibility, do a comma, and this will then allow us to implement an interface. So in Kotlin, after the colon, the first class can be the parent class, then any subsequent classes can be an interface or multiple interfaces. So we'll say main activity is not only an app compat activity, but it's also a test fragment listener. Now this says an error because we're not fulfilling that method. If I hover over the error and do Alt-Enter, Option-Enter, we can implement the members, the functions of that interface. And when I use the error, I can see clear activity screen. So I could do OK to bring in that method, or I can simply just start typing it. So actually, I'll go to the bottom to start typing clear activity screen. And because we're implementing the test fragment listener interface, Android Studio knows that this is something we probably want to override. So I'm going to auto-complete that. And now I've got a method. So there's a way now for the fragment and the activity to talk to each other. And what I'll do is I will just clear the edit text and the text view on the screen. So I'll go ahead and just do binding.editText.setText to empty. And I'll clear the text view, make that empty also. And I'll even go ahead and remove the fragment. So we will fully clear the screen whenever this method happens. Okay? We can now go back to our test fragment, and we can capture the main activity whenever you make that empty also. And I'll even go ahead and remove the fragment. So we will fully clear the screen whenever this method happens. Okay? We can now go back to our test fragment, and we can capture the main activity inside onAttach. Now there's a new programming concept called casting, which we haven't talked about, and I'll be sure to cover it in the next section. But all casting does is it takes a variable of one type, say context. Now in code, Android has no idea what this context is, whether it's main activity, some other activity, it doesn't know. So what you can say is, I promise you that when this context comes in, it is going to be main activity. So I can do context as main activity, and that's casting. If we get it wrong and it's a different activity, well, that's going to cause a runtime exception. That's going to crash. So we have to be very sure. It's a bit of a dangerous thing to do. But we could cast context as main activity and promise that at runtime, the context will definitely be main activity. But we can go one further. We can actually cast it as our test fragment listener. If you look, main activity is a test fragment listener. Okay, so that should also succeed as long as main activity is the context in onAttach. So then what we can do is we can actually set the fragment listener variable to be this context. So we'll do fragment listener equals, and then the context, but turn it into a test fragment listener. We're promising that this context will be a test fragment listener. This is a concept called casting, and in the very next section I will do a specific programming tutorial on casting to make sure we are fully comfortable with it as a concept. I just need to use casting here to show you how some programmers use onAttach as a way to communicate with activities from fragments. So then what you would do in the onDetach method, you would clear that variable. So fragment listener equals null, and this guarantees that you don't get some sort of detached fragment still calling methods on an activity. That can be really dangerous. So now we have this, we could call fragment listener dot clear activity screen. So we just need some button or something in our fragment layout to show this in action. So I'll go to fragment underscore test, and I'll now make layout height to be wrap content, which should cause it to jump to the top of the screen. And it does. And we're getting a complaint because we haven't constrained it vertically, so we'll do top to the top of the parent. So we have the text view at the top, and then we'll add a button underneath it. So we'll say button, wrap content. The text can be clear the screen, exclamation mark. And we'll do button clear screen as the ID, and I should do top to the bottom of the text view. Maybe give it a little bit of space, margin top 2040p. And it looks a bit weird on the left, so I will center it. So I do start to the start of parent, end to the end of parent. There's opposing constraints. So we now have a button that we can click within our fragment. So what I will now do in the test fragment code is I'll set a button click listener. Now, a quick quiz. Where would you set the button click listener in this code? And why would you put it there? The answer is So we now have a button that we can click within our fragment. So what I will now do in the test fragment code is I'll set a button click listener. Now, a quick quiz. Where would you set the button click listener in this code? And why would you put it there? The answer is in onViewCreated. We should do nothing other than inflate the view and return it in onCreateView. We should do all of our heavy lifting in onViewCreated. So button clear screen dot set on click listener. And what we can do, I'll just make a line break in this click listener block. We can use the fragment listener, which might be null. So we'll do a safe call question mark and then do dot clear activity screen. So this is a nullable variable, but we intend to capture it in the onAttach method by taking the context and casting it, so converting our main activity to a test fragment listener variable. So this means we can do clear activity screen. We can't do anything else. We can't do onCreate or on saved instance state. We only have access to the methods exposed by the interface. This is a really safe way of giving a fragment access to some methods in a parent activity. You define an interface, which is the contract, and you make the activity implement the interface, and then you capture the context as it comes into the app. So then the fragment can only call these methods. So just to finish off this introduction to the fragment lifecycle, let's run the app now and show this concept of onAttach and onDetach and how it can be used to capture the context and then interact with the context. Let's now see it in action. So I'm going to run the code. And just to show things on the screen, I will add an edit text. I'll say, hello there, I want to save this message. I'll click save message. I've got my preview. I'll even add some more text. Here is some more text. So we've got some content in our edit text. We've got some content in the text view. I'm going to close the keyboard and then click show fragment. Okay, so we've made it into our new fragment. It's not centered anymore. The screen looks awful with all those purple buttons. I do apologize for that. So now when we click clear the screen, what do we expect? We expect the edit text to clear, the text view to clear, and then the remove fragment code to be called, which should then remove the fragment also. So let's try it. And you see that? Everything is cleared. But that code happened in main activity, in our method that we overrode using the interface. Okay, so using onAttach and onDetach is a perfectly valid way for a fragment to communicate with an activity. It's a bit of an old-fashioned way. There are more modern ways of doing it. Most commonly, a fragment often just needs to return a result of some sort to an activity, and there's a nice new way of doing that. But if you have a need for your fragment to communicate with your activity, to call some methods, well, you can use the methods onAttach and onDetach to achieve that. We've also covered how onCreateView and onViewCreated are pretty much the only fragment lifecycle methods you're going to be using most of the time. And this rounds off our final tutorial in the Activity Lifecycle section. We're going to deep dive into all things to do with the lifecycle. You're going to be seeing these concepts over and over again throughout the rest of this course, and it's absolutely fantastic that we have this deep understanding of how the activity and the fragment lifecycle work. So let's move back now into finishing off our record keeper app.